all loose items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. Believe it or not, there was once a time when theme parks were rather humorless. Now, don't get me wrong, they could be fun, but the rides themselves lacked sight gags and other shenanigans that make us laugh and stay with us when we get home. But then artist and Imagineer Marc Davis came along. Like the dog holding the prison cell key in Pirates of the Caribbean? That's Marc's work. How about, well, I don't know, any of the gags in Jungle Cruise? Yeah, those are Marc's as well. It's rather safe to say that the whimsical tone of Disney theme parks owes a great debt to Davis, but it's also a sad reality that many people have never heard of the man's name. Well, author and Imagineer Christopher Merritt wants to change all of that with a massive and beautiful book he recently co-authored entitled Marc Davis in His Own Words. Chris sat down with me to chat about his pathway into Disney Imagineering and how a decades-long mentorship with Davis changed him on both an artistic and personal level. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Chris Merritt, thank you so much for coming on Dreamfinders. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I want to dive into your new book about Marc Davis, Marc Davis in His Own Words. But first, I want to talk a little bit about your origin story. You mentioned learning to draw at an early age by copying some of Davis's work. Where did you grow up and when did you start drawing, sort of tracing his stuff at a young age?
So I grew up in Orange County in Southern California, not Orange County in Florida. And so as a kid, I was really lucky. I grew up in the 70s, and I was really fortunate enough to get to go to Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm and SeaWorld and other theme and amusement parks a lot as a kid. And particularly Disneyland, I always looked forward to. Was always kind of a Disney fan, too, since a young age. But Disneyland in particular held a special place in my heart and big fascination for me. So I don't know how old I was, but, along with other souvenir guidebooks and things, one of the souvenir guidebooks I was had purchased for me by my parents was this Pirates of the Caribbean souvenir guidebook, and they don't make it anymore. But I had a copy of it in the 70s, and what's really interesting about it is it's the story of creating Pirates of the Caribbean, the attraction, but it's full of a lot of photos of Imagineers. Working at WED Enterprises. So for those of your listeners who don't know, WED Enterprises is the original name of what is now known as Walt Disney Imagineering. So if I say WED, that's what I'm talking about. In fact, the early name of the book was Marc Davis Goes to WED, but everyone shot that down because they thought it sounded like he was going to get married. But anyway, back to the book. But the book, what's really cool about that book is it's absolutely chock full of artwork, and I would say about 90% of it is by Marc Davis. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but as a little kid, there's this really cool, on the end pages, map of Pirates of the Caribbean done by Sam McKim as well. And so I used to copy and trace these drawings out of the book. Sometimes I'd copy it by eye, sometimes I'd literally trace it. And so for me, it was just a really great school of, wow, look at how strong the pose is and how great the line work is. I think I have a big love for pen and ink art and line work. And so both Marc Davis and Sam McKim did a lot of pen and ink work. And so anyway, but I didn't know who Marc was. So now if you want to fast forward to the late 1980s as a teen, I was working at Disneyland as the Jungle Cruise skipper. And so that was a really fun job. And on my breaks, rather, because they give you a lot of breaks to keep you fresh. They had just opened this, what is now known as the Disney Gallery, above Pirates of the Caribbean. It's in a different location on Main Street now, but it was really kind of the first time that Disney and Imagineering had allowed concept art to be displayed in almost museum-like setting. And so on my breaks, I remember they had the first big exhibit was the art of Disneyland. And I climbed up the stairs and I went up and looked around and I went, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Like, this is the guy. Like, this is the guy I was tracing and copying as a little kid. So it was Marc Davis. And amazing pieces of artwork from Jungle Cruise, Enchanted Tiki Room, Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean, all sorts of, classic Disneyland shows that he'd worked on. So I went, wow, that's really, really cool. Around the same time, I was also going to local community college, and I had a paper I had to write on a modern day artist. And so I thought, wow, well, I would really love to talk about Marc Davis, and I wonder if he is around and findable, and if I could actually go interview him and do the paper on that way. So I went ahead and I wrote a letter, cold, sent it up to the studio, Walt Disney Studios, and said, would you please forward this to Mr. Davis? And I asked in the letter if I could possibly come up and interview him. And believe it or not, a couple of weeks later, I was really surprised that someone must have forwarded it to him, because he wrote me back this really nice letter and said, my wife, Alice, and I would be happy to host you at our house and come on up for the day. And so I was amazed, of course. And I got in the car with my father. We drove up and spent the day with Marc and Alice. And it was absolutely amazing. His home is like a museum. I mean, first of all, it's just loaded with artwork by him, artwork by Mary Blair, other artists he likes, and then they're big collectors and fans of Papua New Guinea artifacts. So masks and artwork and tribal pieces, so the house was like a museum. So that was pretty amazing to me. So as we worked our way through the house, Marc took myself and my father downstairs to, they had, basically they owned two houses on the property, and took me across to the second house downstairs. And we sat and I did this interview with Marc where I asked him every question I could think of about the theme parks. I didn't ask him too much about animation, although I was interested in animation. I actually was about to go to CalArts for character animation. But what I was really fascinated with was the theme park design, because if maybe you know or don't know this, but prior to, I would say, the mid 1990s, there really wasn't anyone doing very much in terms of documentation and historical documentation on people who did theme park design. There was maybe in the 80s, I think there was maybe one book on Disneyland. So I was really hungry to learn about it. Going to these theme parks growing up, I don't think I was really cognizant of the fact that I wanted to do this as a living at this point, but I did. I was fascinated with it, and because there was no information out there on how these things were done, I was even more fascinated. So to get to sit with Marc Davis and ask him all these questions, well, when you did the Haunted Mansion, like, how did you do the ballroom scene, or how did you stage the elephants in the sacred bathing elephant pool in the Jungle Cruise? I work on the Jungle Cruise. How did you do this and this and this, and how did you come around to doing Pirates of the Caribbean, and what did Walt Disney say to you? So I asked him every question I could think of. And at a certain point I said, well, Marc, that's really fascinating. I think your artwork is amazing. I said, did you happen to save anything? And he said, well, as I say, kid, come on over here. And he took me into another room. Well, the other room turned out to be his studio. And which was amazing to see, with his drawing table and his pens and pencils and paintbrushes. And he said, wait right here. And he went into a closet and he came out with several basically, manila envelopes full of drawings. And what they were his original pencil rough sketches. So all his final artwork, all the beautiful watercolors that, for people who are fans of Marc Davis know, those all were turned in and reside at Walt Disney Imagineering. But his early rough sketches, scribbles, coming up with the ideas and kind of working things out, he saved all those. And that was completely fascinating, because, he'd pull out a drawing and it would be the Hitchhiking Ghost, like his original pencil sketch for the Hitchhiking Ghosts, right? That's all. But then there'd be a raft of other drawings that were ideas for ghost gags that he never did anything with. Like in a lot of cases, never took to a painted version. And so the only version of that really exists is his little scribble, and there were little notes to himself. So for me as a designer, this was gold, because you got a sense of his thought process. So that was fascinating to me. And then I can go on and on from there, but very fortunate for me, Mark and Alice basically let me stay close with them and stay in touch with them and become friends with them. They came to CalArts when I ended up there to do lectures at several occasions. They went to my graduation, which was like bringing a rock star to your graduation. Just a big part of my life. And so I always kind of stayed close to them. And what was really, really cool for me is that in the 90s, and what's interesting is Pete Docter was fortunate enough to do this too. I didn't find this out till later, but I could call Mark and Alice up and say, right, hey, I'm going to be in your neighborhood next week. Can I take you guys to lunch at the Tam O'Shanter? And I'd like to ask you everything I can think of about the Enchanted Tiki Room, right? And so sitting with Mark and Alice and hearing these stories firsthand from the people who did the designs of it and worked closely with Walt Disney, that was amazing to me. So getting into this book, that was our real hope with the book, is that, we would go and visit them, and maybe Pete was asking Mark, well, how did you animate Maleficent? And I was asking him, well, how did you stage things in America Sings? We were both asking him a lot of questions, and we'd always kind of leave going, wow, oh, I should have asked him this, and I should have asked him this. And, so the book is an attempt to kind of recreate visiting with Mark and Alice at their house, if you could see and talk about every single thing he worked on in his career at WED, at Imagineering. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's a 760-page, 2-volume, 11-pound book, which I have to really thank my publisher, Wendy Lefcon, and at Disney Editions, for really getting behind us doing something this big, because I didn't think they were going to let us do something this big. It's quite an investment, and it's a $150 book. I feel it's a more than fair trade, because the amount of information you're getting in this is really amazing. So that's where all this kind of comes from for me.
I'm curious. I'm always fascinated by the studios of creative people. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a picture of what Marc Davis's studio was like. Was it messy? Was it kept nice? What was his comfortable nature when it comes to sort of his environment and being creative?
I would say it was half messy and half nice. There were certainly things on the wall, and he had, a cork board with push pins of, cutouts and things. Oh, on the cork board, he had Abraham Lincoln's original latex mold of his hand. The first prototype. It was like, oh, that's Lincoln's original hand. Here I kept. But there were parts of it that were messy too. And if you'd like, I can send you, some photos I took of it at the time.
Hey, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, it was both, and it was just amazing to me. He did say to me, I don't know how to describe this, but it's a very small wooden angled. It's about maybe 18 or 20 inches wide and maybe about 12, 13 inches tall. Angled piece of, it's wood. It's a little drawing table, a little small one that you could easily move around, but at an angle. And I believe he had it made at WED in the 60s. And he had his name painted in the corner, and there were about a zillion pushpin holes in them. And there's, photos of him in the book at Imagineering working on, say, a painting for Pirates of the Caribbean in Florida in, the early 70s. And it's at that drawing table. So he kept that, and he kept his chair from his office, and another wooden chair that he said, oh, Walt Disney used to sit in that chair. And that was kind of it. That and the drawings, those are the things he kept. And interestingly enough, he didn't keep too much from his animation days. He had an odd cell or two, peppered about, but he kept all his pencil roughs from Imagineering, which of course was, delightful to me because that was what I was really, really interested in.
Was it just because of access to the animation cells, or was his interest just by the time you got to meet him, was he just more interested in show design and that sort of thing? And it wasn't not that he didn't care for his work in animation, but that it was sort of the thing he did before the thing that he liked to do.
A little bit. He would make comments more in regards to Walt Disney than himself, but about, when he said, when Walt would finish with something, he didn't really like to get, too nostalgic and relive it. He liked to move on to his next thing. And I felt like Marc kind of felt like that a little bit too, but it can't be 100% accurate because he wouldn't have kept all those pencil rough sketches of all his Imagineering artwork if he really, really felt that. I also think just with animation, for him, he was drawing with a pencil, and those drawings need to be turned in so the inkers and painters can,
Right.
trace them off. And then from there, they get filed away. Early rough sketches where he's doing kind of development and trying to work out an idea, that's something that, you're not going to necessarily turn in. I mean, I keep my pencil rough sketches. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I throw them away. It depends on if I think they're worth keeping or not. But certainly you are supposed to turn in all the final artwork. But your little doodles, your little thumbnails, kind of napkin sketches, But for me, Marc Davis napkin sketches are unbelievable, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right. I'm curious about Marc and Alice's relationship a little bit. And for those who don't realize, Marc, of course, was in Imagineering, but Alice was as well. She was in costuming and is a legend completely in her own right when it comes to what she did. What was their sort of interactions like? It's sort of interesting to watch two amazing creatives interact. And I was just curious sort of how they bantered about, as it were.
They were almost like any other married couple I've ever known. they lightly bickered sometimes, but they also really supported each other. And I love Alice Davis so much. She's done so much for me personally in my life, and of course we couldn't have done this book without her. But just visiting them as a couple and talking to them about things, it was really interesting because, in particular, if you asked a question about Pirates of the Caribbean or It's a Small World, Alice did the costumes for most of those attractions. And so it was really fun to, I would ask Marc, well, how did you, how did you do Pirates of the Caribbean? And he would be telling me about Walt's ideas and doing the wax museum version. And, then they went to the New York World's Fair. But around the time that Marc and Alice got married, they were eating at the Tam O'Shanter, and they both liked to go there a lot. And so did Walt Disney. And they saw Walt by himself. So they kind of waved him over, and Walt came over and said, "Oh, this must be the new Mrs. Davis. Very nice to meet you. What do you do?" And Alice had just graduated from Chouinard, majoring in costume design. And Walt Disney said, "Oh, well, you'll come work for me one of these days." And in short order, she did on Pirates and Small World. Well, it was fun to ask them that because they would go back and forth, right? And Marc would remember something, and then Alice would chime in and add something, or Marc would say something and Alice would correct him, and then he'd say, "No, I remember it like this." So it was kind of cute, right? And it's just, I don't know, it was just amazing to me to I'm sitting here with the people who did it, and also at that time starting to think, I think I'd like to maybe try and be a theme park designer someday too. You couldn't ask for two better teachers in terms of, what Marc designed, what came out of Marc's pen and pencil. A lot of the bedrock principles that we use, that I still use today in terms of staging and theme park design, really came from Marc. And it's interesting to hear Marc talk about how he started this second career where he, as he said, sat on his butt as an animator for 35 years. And he's learning this new art form, and he's teaching himself things, and he's teaching Walt Disney things, and Walt Disney's teaching him things, and they're trying things. all these things that end up being the bedrock of how do you stage something in a theme park attraction? How do you make it clear so it's readable so that the guests get the gag right away? I can't think of a better example of that than Jungle Cruise or Pirates of the Caribbean or the work he did on Haunted Mansion. The staging is just kind of flawless. So that was fascinating to hear him talk about that.
Yeah, and if you look through his sketches overall, a lot of them bring a chuckle.
Right.
And how do you think his penchant for humor affected not only theme park design as a whole, but also possibly your own style?
Well, I don't think you can underestimate the effect that Marc had on the theme park industry. I mean, you see other, theme park and amusement park companies with their attractions trying to copy what was done at Disney all the time. I can't tell you how many, Small World ripoffs I saw in China when I was working in China, because we'd go to these, here's the scary amusement park we're going to go visit, today, because there are all these amusement parks in China. And there was one in particular that was this really weird, blatant ripoff of Small World, and it had like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in it, and the not the Transformers. What are the the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers were in it. It was really weird. Anyway, but the kind of gags and ideas and things that Marc really came up with have been copied endlessly. Was your other question that how did it influence me?
Yeah, I'm just curious. How did it influence your artistic style?
Well, hugely. It's hard for me to put it into words. His staging, and one of the first things that I remember him telling me is, I said, well, how do you do this? He goes, well, kid, as I say, you got to make it read. Well, what Marc means by make it read, and it's a principle that he really learned from doing animation for so many years. If you're in an attraction in an environment, you're generally in a moving vehicle, or even when you're not, when you're walking through something, but generally when you're in a moving vehicle and you're coming into a scene, you've got seconds to make sense of what's going on in front of you. So staging is really important. They used to give us an assignment at CalArts. One of my teachers was Mike Giamo, who was the art director for Frozen and many other films. And he would give us a assignment to do a silhouette. So come up with a pose for a character and do a silhouette, and but black it all in. And so if you can really easily make out what's going on in that pose with it all blacked out, that's a good pose. And if you look at a lot of Marc's drawings, I don't care for what project, the poses are so good you can black them in and they still read as what the situation is, what the character is supposed to be. And of course, the other big thing is the humor. For whatever reason, Marc was a natural at coming up with funny gags. And it's a little ironic because he tended to be a fairly serious guy a lot of the time. Although he did, this is in the book, Alice said, he would do what she called a chortle. Yeah, a chortle. And she said, she would see him drawing something and he would be kind of sitting there and he'd kind of go, kind of, I guess like a chuckle and something else mixed together. So, you just look at Marc's ideas and his artwork and it's so funny. You think about something like the rhino gag in the Jungle Cruise, which interestingly enough, he designed as Walt Disney asked him to come up with a series of vignettes that people were going to see only on the train to kind of advertise the attractions. So he came up with ones for all going around Disneyland, but the Jungle Cruise one he came up with, one of them was the rhino poking the guys in the butt, climbing the pole. And Walt Disney told him, "Oh, Marc, that's too good. You got to put that in the ride," which they did. It's it's iconic, right? It's like the stretching portraits. It's this iconic part of the Jungle Cruise. Well, he was a natural at that. So much of his artwork is funny. Even when you get, you fast forward into the 70s with the work he did in Florida and the work he did in Epcot, he designed, I would say, about 3/4 of the World of Motion attraction. And again, those are all like classic Marc Davis gags, just really funny stuff. the guy on the unicycle, up in the tree who's, gotten chased by the dog, and just really, there's lots of other examples, but really, really funny situations. He was a master at that.
Is there a particular gag that just always makes you laugh? Like one of yours that's just a favorite?
Yeah, I think the gorillas in the who've overturned the camp in the Jungle Cruise is always really funny. And the rhino gag in the Jungle Cruise. Of course, I'm partial to Jungle Cruise because I'm a former skipper. I always thought that was really, really funny and really staged really well. Let's see. Pirates of the Caribbean, I always laugh at the scene in the burning city where there's a pirate and he's stealing a bunch of hats, and he's got one foot on the dock and one foot on a boat, right? And then he's wearing he's wearing like 10 hats, like all stacked up on his head, and the hats are wobbling back and forth. I think that's really, really funny. I think almost all of his gags in the Haunted Mansion and the Graveyard are just really, really great. Again, staged really, really well. You can see everything really clearly. I love he didn't like this too much because he thought they kind of messed up his staging, but the gag at the end, right before you see the hitchhiking ghost, where there's a mummy that's leaned up out of his coffin, and then there's an old man with one of those, I don't know what you call them, but a hearing horn. He's got a big horn. And he's saying, "What's that? What's that?" And then there's a dog like sniffing the sarcophagus that the mummy's given. I don't know, man. I don't know what's going on there, but it's funny. It's really funny. Yeah. So.
Let me ask you about your co-author of the book, of course, Pete Docter, who people may know as he directed Up, and now he's the chief creative officer over at Pixar. Do you remember when you first two met? You said that he was also influenced and had some mentorship by the Davises. Was that at CalArts?
Yeah, so I was a freshman, and he was either a senior or he was just heading out. He was just starting at Pixar, and I seem to recall someone saying, "Oh, Pete Docter, you should talk to him. He does really great animation and really great work." So some of the student films that Pete had done, I looked up. And so when I saw him on campus one day, I introduced myself and just kind of kept in touch with him. And turns out Pete is a major fan of Disneyland as well as Disney animation. So unbeknownst to me, in the 90s at that same time, he was visiting Mark and Alice occasionally and asking them questions about animation. So,
oh, yeah, and you had no idea.
No, I had no. I had no idea. And
that's wild.
And just for what it's worth, there are loads of other students that were going and visiting Mark and Alice. Mark and Alice never had kids; they had dogs, right? But they were so gracious and so willing to help young artists. There's a plethora of young artists, not just who went to CalArts, but other places too, who they just opened up their doors to, and would let people come in and they'd feed them and, talk to them and give them artistic advice and encouragement. So this is why I say, aside from the fan of Imagineering and theme park history to put this book out, this book is also a big thank you to them for all that they've done for myself and for Pete and lots of other artists. But back to Pete. So Pete and I just kind of became, we were friends. We saw each other over the years. There were, a couple of nights, Tony Baxter had Disneyland nights up at Pixar where we'd come and we'd show like old home movies of, Disneyland is very nerdy, up at Pixar. So that's kind of how I knew Pete, and would talk to him occasionally, but, not like, best friends hanging out every weekend, just kind of acquaintances who both had a mutual interest. So fast forwarding to... This is, 5 years ago, so it's 2014, 2013, something like that. I was on assignment in China, working on Shanghai Disneyland on Mickey Avenue. And then I was coming home, exhausted every night, but I was still keeping in touch with Alice Davis. So I would Skype Alice in the evening. And I would say, "Hey, Alice, I had this thing happen at the shop today, or this thing happened with a vendor today. What do you suggest?" And she would say, "Oh, well, you should bring them donuts because everyone likes donuts." I'd be like, okay.
She's right.
She is right. But I was finishing up my work on my second book, which is a book called Pacific Ocean Park: The Rise and Fall of Los Angeles's Space Age Nautical Pleasure Pier, which is
And before this, you wrote a book about Knott's Berry Farm as well.
correct. Yeah, that's called Knott's Preserved, and it's a history of Knott's Berry Farm. So I write books for myself that I want to read that no one else I don't think will do, is what this comes down to. But so in that vein, I was talking to Alice and I just said, hey, I'm finishing up on this other book and I'm not sure I should start a third book right away. But I just said, I really feel like Marc really deserves a big, beautiful coffee table book of all his time in Imagineering. And it would have to be this really big book to fit all the artwork in, or as much of the artwork in as we could get. And she said, oh, Marc would be so pleased if you did that. And I said, well, that's great that you think that. I said, would you, if I was able to get this going, would you give me access to the house, all the old drawings and whatever else you saved? And she said, yeah, I think that would be okay. And I said, okay. And then I started thinking about it. I thought, well, how do I do this? How do I do this in a way that really opens up the doors of access at work? Because even though I'm an employee of the Walt Disney Company, it's sometimes hard to get access and to these things. And so I called Pete up and I said to Pete, I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this book, and I really would need your help. It would be really great to have your name attached because that would open up lots of doors, but not to be totally mercenary too. I actually would really need your help because I tend to be a person who I'm fascinated with everything, right? And so I really needed a good editor, someone who could help basically focus me in, which is exactly what Pete ended up doing. So, Pete, I said to him, I said, look, I'll make you a deal. I'll do 95% of the work. I'll do the research. I'll transcribe the interviews, the times, that I tape recorded myself talking to him and all the other ones. And I'll just kind of pull everything together if you would really, help me by editing me and focusing me in to make this accessible for the average reader. And he said, yeah. He said, absolutely. He said, that sounds like a really great project. Okay, so now I had, Pete agreeing to do a book with me. And then I didn't know this at the time, but he had told my publisher at Disney Editions, who called me up and said, why don't you submit a proposal? So for anyone who's trying to get a book deal or a book off the ground, if a publisher calls you up or says, hey, give me a proposal, that you should jump on that because getting a book deal is really, really difficult. So that's kind of how we started. So, and then from there, we just started working on it. And and it's taken, the amount of work, it's taken 5 years of lunch breaks and bus rides to the site in Shanghai and train rides from Orange County to Glendale, because I had to put many hours a day in on this thing. The amount of work, getting everything transcribed so it was in Marc's own words, and then a bunch of new interviews I did too with a lot of other Imagineers. So Marty Sklar and Blaine Gibson, right before they passed, gave me a lot of great information. Rolly Crump, Bob Gurr, and of course Alice. And then I really went out of my way to track down a lot of the people who worked in the machine shop, which used to be called MAPO at Imagineering, and a lot of the guys who actually built the figures. So they would tell me these fascinating stories about, Marc Davis and Blaine Gibson would come over to the machine shop and say, right, we're going to do this figure for Country Bear Jamboree. And Marc said, here's my sketches, and I want it to move like this. And then, Blaine would say, right, but I need to have like this much and this to make the sculpture work. And then you guys in the machine shop, you're going to design the armature and you're going to come up with the mechanics to make it move. Everyone's like working together in this collaborative way. That was really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the overall process of putting together the photos, because the Imagineering Art Collection team kind of gets involved at some point, and not only are you bringing in things from the Davis's home, but you're using stuff from Disney. Right. What was that sort of delicate process like to get colors right in the print and all of that?
Well, you have to. I can't praise. We're calling her our curator right now, Vanessa Hunt, who works in the Imagineering art collections. She really took on that responsibility, and I certainly didn't realize, and she didn't realize what she was signing herself up for, because they ended up rephotographing, I think, over 1,000 pieces of artwork.
Wow.
Because we wanted the colors to be the most accurate they've ever been. In previous publications, the colors have been off, or they've used old scans, from 10, 20 years ago. So that was really important to us. And then just in terms of the photographs, again, like you say, we borrowed things from Alice's house. We borrowed things from private collections. And then, of course, there are several different photo collections at the Walt Disney Company in general. So everything from the Archives collection to the Walt Disney Imagineering photo collection. And then even things like I tracked down one of the photographers who worked for National Geographic. And he was sending us kind of not great scans off like a home scanner of his original slides. And so we talked him into, he mailed us his slides. We very carefully scanned them and sent them back. Or we found an amazing collection at the Library of Congress, which are the remnants of Look magazine in the 1960s for the New York World's Fair. They sent an interviewer and a photographer over to Glendale when Imagineering was in this really small building we call the 800 Sonora building. And they followed Walt around for the day. And these are the most amazing photos to me. They're in black and white, but they're still incredible because it's Walt and Marc Davis and all the other Imagineers working. They're not posing for pictures. You see a picture of someone working on a new film and you say, oh, you can tell someone went in their office and said, hey, pretend like you're working.
Yeah.
These photos from the Library of Congress, they just caught them in action working. And they're really, it's really a you are there moment, which was one of the goals of the book, right? Like, I feel like I told Pete early on, I said, no one cares what we have to say about writing about the glory of the 1964 New York World's Fair. I said, well, maybe they do for you, but not for me. I think what people want to get in a time machine, and they want to go back to the 1960s, and they want to be a fly in the wall in Marc Davis's office when Walt came in and he's talking to him about Pirates of the Caribbean, or they want to be in Blaine Gibson's studio where he's sculpting the funny elephants for the Jungle Cruise and Mark's coming in and talking to him about it. That's what people really want. So it was important, to me, to put all this in Mark's words and other Imagineers' words, so you feel like you're getting it straight from them, which you are. So Vanessa and her team at the art collections at Imagineering worked really, really hard to make everything look as good as it does. So when you get your hands on the book, just try and take a look at that, because even certain crummy, small negatives of things that were blurry, like Vanessa worked her magic on and kind of brought it back to life. And it's not just Vanessa. There's a whole team that worked there with them, Mike Jusko and Denise Brown. And then I have to give a great shout out to our book designer, Paul Wolski, who took, Vanessa had this concept of, what if we designed this book to look like a 1960s Disneyland guidebook? And in one of the guidebooks, there are all these blocks of color that we use. So you'll see blocks of color surrounding other Imagineers' quotes, because we had this problem in that we had 3 different trains running simultaneously, trying to give you information that we didn't want you to be confused about. We had kind of overview imparting information about what you're about to read about from myself and Pete. And then you had Mark's own words himself. And then you had other Imagineers chiming in. So you can imagine from a visual standpoint, that could have gotten very confusing and very difficult to read very fast. So Vanessa kind of came up with this blocks of color thing. And then Paul Wolski really, really drove home the design. And Paul did the cover of the book, which I just think I really love. So, yeah.
Well, as we finish up here, I want to ask you, what's a piece of advice, creative advice, that Marc gave you that to this day still sticks in your head when you're working?
One of the big things that Marc said to me, well, the 2 big things, the one I mentioned before about staging and making things read, he was dead serious about that. And he would get very upset if he drew something in a certain way and then he didn't have control over it being staged in the attraction. So that was a big deal to him, staging. But the other thing that I think was interesting was his idea that you need to try as many ideas as you can. And Marc was a machine. Marc would come up with 20 ideas for something and just riff on that gag. He told me at one time at the studio, I think this was in his animation days, he was in a meeting with Walt Disney and someone came up to Walt Disney and had a drawing and held it up to Walt and said, "Hey, Walt, what do you think about this drawing?" And Walt Disney looked at him and he said, "Well, it's awfully hard to choose between one." and I think that was an ethos that Marc subscribed to, is that, I'm not just going to sit here and just, throw out my first idea on something. I'm going to come up with 20 ideas for something. So I end up with 3 or 4 that are really, really great. And like I say, these iconic gags that Marc designed in what really are the bedrock. When you think of Disneyland and Walt Disney World and the Disney theme parks in general, when you think of the iconic attractions, I mean, what do you think of? You think of Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean and It's a Small World and the Enchanted Tiki Room and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln and Country Bear Jamboree and America Sings and, things like that. So much of what we remember from those attractions that are iconic really came from Marc's pencil and from his mind. And so that was another thing that was important to me to get out in this book, to make people really realize, oh my gosh, he came up with so much of this. And one of the ways he came up with so much of this is he forced himself to sit down and come up with as many ideas as possible to pick out the best amongst those.
Chris Merritt, thank you so much for coming on Dreamfinders and talking about Marc Davis. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. It was so great to talk with Christopher Merritt about his love of Marc Davis, and you should make sure to check out he and Pete Docter's new book about that Disney legend titled Marc Davis in His Own Words. It's amazing and available now online or at your local bookstore. Dreamfinders is edited by Shannen Michaelsen. It's hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Our podcast artwork is provided by JP Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at WDWNT.com. Tell your friends about the show, and please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It sure helps others find our work. Also, if you or someone else you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@WDWNT.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it. Dreamfinders is sponsored by Never Grow Up Vacations, the official travel partner of WDWNT.com. Never Grow Up Vacations specializes in trips to Disney destinations around the world, so be like us and never grow up. Head over to nevergrowupvacations.com to book your next trip today.